Surprising to me that on a Tuesday night you can come out to listen to what you've got to say. That's really nice. Let's just pray first, shall we? God our Father, it's always a joy and a delight to assemble together. We thank you that you've put your Spirit within our hearts, and we thank you that you've made your word a light unto our feet. We pray that as we look into it tonight and think about the things that are on your heart, that we'll be blessed as we do so. Amen.
Amen.
Well, if you have come today, I'm hoping that what you've come to hear is something about this. If you've read your notices, this is what I'm reliably informed I'm supposed to be speaking about. So how should we view the nation of Israel today? Are they the same chosen people of God that we read of in the Scripture? Does the nation of Israel reflect God's heart today? Well, I want to start by dealing with the middle bit of that. So I've put it in three colours so you can see what the middle bit is. I want to look at something about chosen people of God that we read of in the Scripture, and then having built a framework, a base, if you like, for what I want to say, then we can look at the outside edges of that subject. The first question, obviously, then, is has God, or did God, have a chosen people? I think the answer, in my opinion, is yes, he did. And we can read about that in Deuteronomy 7. I haven't got all of it up there, but in verse 6 he says, "For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for himself, a special treasure above all the peoples on the face of the earth. The Lord did not set his love on you, nor choose you, because you were more in number than any other people, for you were the least of all peoples, but because the Lord loves you, and because he would keep the oath which he swore to your fathers, the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand." So it says very clearly there that there are a people that he chose. And the nature of that choosing is something to do with grace. It's not because they were great, it's not because they were better, it was not even because they were good. It says he chose them because he loved them. So that's the first thing to get in our minds, that God does have a chosen people. And then the second thing is that he gave them a place. And that place happens to be over the other side of the Mediterranean. Some of us have been there. I went with Forrest. Interestingly, you'd never know we went on the same holiday. I think he went to the Holy Land and I went to Israel. And we did actually, on the same shore, but sometimes these different names crop in. And I will just read this one, Genesis 13. Verse 15. "For all the land which you see, I give to you and your descendants." This is God's promise to some people that this land would be given to them. And more to the point, not only given to them at that time, but given them to their descendants, to those who came after. And finally, it goes too fast, doesn't it? That's it. There we go, it's that one. He would give the land to them, and he would give it to their descendants, and the time span over which that giving would occur would be forever. Which sounds like a pretty long time to me. And I think we need to keep that in mind when we start to think about these things, because God makes promises, and I happen to be in the camp that believes that when God says a thing, he's pretty reliable. I don't know where you stand on that, but I stand in that camp. I think when he says things, he tends to mean it, and we'll look in a minute as to why that's really, really important. In the New Testament, it says the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. Now that is used in this particular case in the context of discussions of, well, what about Israel then? It's not talking specifically about sort of gifts of the Spirit or something like that. It's talking about the fact that when Paul is debating the whole issue of what about the Jewish people then, he comes to the conclusion that the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable, which means God doesn't take them back. So on that basis, I think I want to conclude that God still has a chosen people, and they still have a land, and on that basis, we need to start to look at, has anything changed? And in some people's eyes, a great deal has changed. There is a theory, it generally tends to be called replacement theology, and the general gist of it is that somehow God turned his attention away from the Jewish people and decided instead that he would turn his attention towards the church. I once wrote a very long letter to a Christian magazine objecting to such a theory when they published it, and sadly, when they actually printed my letter, there was only about 2 paragraphs left. It's the nature of this thing, isn't it? But it is a serious position held by a number of people that basically says, well, they did something that somehow undid the words and the calling of God. And therefore, God has turned his heart away, his face away from them, and turned his attention instead onto the church. There we are. The place of the Jewish people in the heart of God has been replaced by the church. Well, the next question really is that true? And I think I want to say that it's absolute baloney. If that's a biblical word. Normally this whole thing is linked to some concept that the Jewish people en masse somehow managed to reject the Messiah. And it was for that reason that God turned away. But I don't believe that that is actually the case. I don't believe that any people actually work en masse. And God in particular is great at saying, I'm not interested in en masse. I really am interested in individuals. And we'll see Paul's arguments in a minute to say, well, was it en masse? No, it's not. And again, you know, there have been accusations levelled against the Jewish people, well, they were Messiah killers or Christ killers or something. I have to mention at this point, I think if you read the scriptures, you'll find it was Pilate and his crew who actually did the crucifixion. So we can't level that against them. The nature of it is that both sides were involved. Yes, the Jewish people, the religious Jewish people wanted him dead, but yes, it was the Gentiles and Pilate and his crew who actually did the dirty, who did the job. And so I think that puts it in its context. I think that if God actually turned away from the Jewish people, we are in serious difficulties. Because if he did, then he's a fickle God. He's a God who can say one thing and then change his mind, and you can no longer stand upon the thing that he said. Now, I've had a lot of discussions about this recently with the Church of the Latter-day Saints up the road, who are quite convinced that God has indeed turned his back on the church because it's been so awful, and therefore has revealed a new message through some golden plates to various people, and they are now the one true church. And you open yourself up to all of that if we say God can be fickle, God can just change his mind, God can take away the promises that he's made and, if you like, tear them up, throw them away, discard them. We have no security in any salvation at all that I can see if God can just be that fickle, if he can just turn away in that sort of way. I believe our faith is secure, our knowledge of Jesus is utterly reliable because God is utterly reliable. And therefore the things that he said back there still hold and still are true. Now Paul has some things to say about this whole sort of issue, who are absolute baloney. And you can set up there.
What's the Greek word for baloney?
I don't know what the Greek for baloney is. We'll have to look it up, won't we?
Sausageticos.
Possibly, yes. Does God deal with people in mass? Paul says, well, what about the Jewish people then? Has God cast them away? And his answer is, no, he hasn't. And you know that that's true because I'm one of them. So his argument is, it doesn't matter how you try and lump everyone together. The plain facts are, because I'm standing in front of you, that you can't lump everyone together. I'm one of the ones who hasn't rejected the Messiah. So have they all rejected the Messiah? No, they haven't. He then says, just think about it. Think about it in the context of history. Just think of Elijah. Elijah was a great guy, he was a man of faith, and he got to a point of saying, oh God, there's only me left, there's only one of me left. And in that situation, God had to say to him, not so. Actually, there are 7,000 others who have not bowed the knee. So all Elijah could see was a one, himself. God said, actually there's 7,000. Now whether it was literally 7,000 or there are 7,001 in total, or whether or not 7,000 is one of those useful Hebrew devices that basically says lots and lots and really good numbers. I'm not going to debate that one today. But he said, in that case, there was a remnant. And so, even now, there is a remnant according to the election of grace. We heard at the beginning, God chose them by grace. Paul says, it's still like that. You may not be able to see them all. Elijah was totally convinced that there was only him left. But sadly he was wrong. Well, not sadly so much really. He was wrong. Because there were others who God had in his heart and who had God in their hearts. And those people were still around. Now interestingly, I just picked up my book here, Roots and Branches. It's an exploration into the Jewish context of the Christian faith, and notice something about a prayer. It's talking about whether you have to say a lot of prayers all the time. And it says here, Rabbi Yehoshua says, if one is travelling in a dangerous place, he says a short prayer. So because it's dangerous, you have to condense them down a bit. But the prayer was just the bit that fascinated me. Namely, O Lord, save your people, the remnant of Israel. So in terms of the Jewish liturgy, when there's an emergency, you're allowed to say a short prayer, and it recognises very clearly that the Lord's people is a remnant of Israel. Not the whole of Israel, but a remnant of Israel. Paul goes on to say, they are not all Israel. who are of Israel. Now what does that mean? I think what it means is you can be Jewish by birth, or you can be Jewish by faith. And he's actually arguing that the two are not the same. So just because you have Jewish parents, in God's eyes, doesn't make you Jewish. Somewhere there's an element of faith in the whole thing, and that without that faith, you might be Jewish by birth, but you're not Jewish by faith. And so Paul is very happy to say they are not all Israel who are of Israel. Now that's Paul's take on it. I just wonder what Jesus' take on it might be. And surprisingly, he says much the same thing. It's always good when you find a bit of sort of Jesus saying stuff and you think, oh yeah, that's exactly what Paul was explaining. Here it is. Here's one bit. In the context, people saying, look, we're good Jews, but we're still persecuting you. Jesus says to them, look, it doesn't quite work like that. Basically, God could take the stones on the ground, and if he felt like it, he could turn those into children of Israel. You know, you think you've got the right birth, but ultimately, God is in the business of doing whatever he wants. And if he chooses to make these stones into children of Israel, then he will. And then it goes on in another place to say, if you were Abraham's children, you would do the works of Abraham. It's the same sort of context, isn't it? It's the fact that if you actually are a true descendant of Abraham and a descendant by faith, then somehow in your lifestyle, in that which you do, it will be pretty obvious. And I can see, I think is what he was saying, that in some of your cases, you are not true descendants of Abraham because of the way you live in and acting. And so both Jesus and Paul are quite clear, I believe, that there are two types of Jewish people. Those who are Jewish because they have the faith of Abraham, and those who are Jewish just because they're birth. And in the end, both say the birth issue doesn't quite count. Somehow, to be truly Jewish, there's an element of faith that has to be working out in life. A little bit more of Paul. Those who are of faith are sons of Abraham. Now I'm going to deal with the next part of the verse in a moment. But some of you may know that song, yes. Father Abraham has many sons. Many sons has Father Abraham. I'm one of them, so you say it's the place. Look, or something like that. I'm not actually quite convinced I believe that. Because it's the Bible, the Hebrew thought pattern is very good at putting two closely similar ideas together. And there being a slight difference between them. And I think I would want to say that the Jewish people who are of faith are the true sons of Abraham. Now that doesn't exclude us if we're Gentiles, because the next bit of the verse says, those who are of faith are blessed who believe in Abraham. And I count myself in that second category. Now you may not see that as two different things, but I think I do. That in the end, there are true sons of Abraham who have faith, and there are others who have faith who join in the benefits of being sons of Abraham without physically being sons of Abraham. Does that make sense? Can you follow me so far?
Are you saying then that it's like, if we use the word Gentile, I'm not a son of Abraham and I can never be because the birth line is not there?
I think that's what it's driving at. The birth line for a Christian is through Jesus, rather than through Abraham.
But we converge on the benefits.
We do indeed converge on the benefits. Lots of converging and lots of benefits. Yes.
And it actually says that in verse 8.
Right?
Between verse 7 and 9.
Yes.
Verse 8 says, the scripture foresaw that God would justify the Gentiles by faith and announce the gospel in advance to Abraham. All nations will be blessed through you. So those who have faith are blessed along with Abraham.
That's good. Excellent. That's why you need context, isn't it? Great stuff. And I think, that there are those two phrases together which look to me to be very similar because of the whole issue of there's Jews and Gentiles. And he puts the two together, I think, to explain that the two fall into slightly different categories, that all of us can be blessed if we are of faith with the faith that Abraham had. If you've stayed with me this far, I'd like to just try and branch out a little bit into where does Israel fit then? And I want to reiterate, I think, what I said earlier, that I don't believe that nations act collectively, in the sense that everyone within a nation is on exactly the same path. That actually God treats nations as a collection of people, and He deals with the people who are in that nation individually. That's a good thing to be able to do. Most of us can't get our brains around that because it's just too many people. But God is the sort of God who's able to deal with an awful lot more than we can, and I think He deals with people individually. So, I think I want to say, God's chosen people and the state of Israel are not the same. So the modern incarnation of the state of Israel, which has basically been around since 1948-ish, is not the same as the chosen people of God that we read in the scriptures. When they were thinking about setting it up, one of the things they did consider was whether the promised land that they would repatriate the Jewish people to should be Uganda. That was a serious contention. On the whole, Jewish people said, well, actually, Uganda doesn't quite cut it. Somehow, Jerusalem has got something to do with what we're aspiring towards, and we really would like Jerusalem back, thank you very much. And out of that, the thing changed. And in 1948, some sort of state of Israel was set up in the place of Israel, which included a little bit of Jerusalem. Now I think we have the same sort of problem in terms of are the chosen people the same as the state of Israel in the church? In that there is an awful lot of people for whom things like the Church of England is the church, or buildings are the church, or indeed institutions are the church, or indeed for some people the Church of the Latter-day Saints is the church. And it's that same sort of issue that says what God deals with is a structure, whereas I believe we've come through things to know that what God deals with is an organism, it's a body of living people, and that with the best will in the world, the Church of England, although it is an expression of people who love the Lord, isn't the church. And so I think I want to say that the state of Israel is not the chosen people. We believe, well I certainly do anyway, that Poplars is part of church in Worksop. And that there is one church in Worksop. Now, the trouble with all political organisations is they get a concept like that and they think, we could make this dead easy. We could just pass a law that says there will only be one meeting in Worksop as from now, and then the job's solved, isn't it? Whereas actually we know that it isn't solved because somehow God is dealing with hearts. He's knitting our hearts to the other believers in a way that is quite different and says we just need one meeting. I don't think there will ever be a situation this side of glory where there's just one meeting. But there will be a place where the people down the road are so much blessed by the fact our hearts are for them, and we are so much blessed by the fact that their hearts are for us, that effectively the oneness will be there. Well, that's how it is, I believe, or wants to be. And so, I think many of his chosen people live within the state of Israel. God still has a chosen people, and they still have a place, and I happen to believe that place is still Israel, and it includes Jerusalem. And there are many people of the Jewish faith who God counts as among that remnant, among those 7,000. And it's probably more than 7,000 these days, because he's not tied down. The mere fact that there is a state of Israel, I think, says something about God's enduring promises. Because I can't think that there are many other nations who have been scattered abroad for nearly 2,000 years, who have been persecuted for the majority of that time, sadly even in this country, for those of you who know about issues up at York and other such places, but who still somehow are recognisably Jewish. I have a feeling that says something about the faithfulness of God in making sure that the promises he made all that time back still hold. I also happen to believe that some of his chosen people may even be trying to run the state of Israel. Again, it's difficult to know, because God sees on the inside of the heart. And it's ever so easy to judge things from the outside. I have no idea what it's like to live in a place where basically you are surrounded by hostile neighbours, many of whom are very keen to see you pushed into the sea. Some of you were here on Sunday when we heard Dave speaking about the fact of what it was like to be in a situation where you hit it and your mate is dead beside you. You've been shot. I have no idea what that's like. And it's ever so easy to say, well, they should be doing things differently, without any real understanding of the pressures of what it actually is to try and live in that sort of situation. Paul, in another context, says, now we understand in part, but then we'll see face to face. The nature of life as I understand it is, we will always see things in part for the moment. So we have a pretty good idea sometimes as to what God's thinking, and sometimes we're just way off base, because we just see in part. We can't see the whole thing. So this is my thought about it. A nation failing to achieve what we think is right is not necessarily a sign that they're not trying to follow God's heart. We have to make allowances for human institutions. We know in our own country we don't always get things right. Would you perhaps agree with me on that?
Yes.
And I think in terms of Israel, they're very visible. because there are a lot of people wanting to make sure that they stay very visible. And so every little misdemeanour is blown up out of all proportion. But that's where I think we need to make allowances for where they are. But I don't want to finish there, because I think God has one more trick up his sleeve, if I can use tricks and sleeves to describe a God who has big plans. In Paul's discussion of how the church and the people of Israel work together, he uses the picture of grafting. Which is basically, you can take a little shoot, you make a cut in a twig, you stick the little shoot in, and somehow the sap that's coming up the main trunk feeds the shoot, and it becomes part of the whole. He uses that to say that as Gentiles, we have been grafted into the people of Israel. If God has discarded them, they are now dead, and I can guarantee that if you take a shoot and graft it into a dead twig, you will find that very soon it's dead. That's how it works. So for Paul to be using the illustration, I believe that he was assuming that there was still life in the shoot. But there is another picture that Paul also uses, and it's that, well, I want to just look at on the last little bit. It's in Ephesians in chapter 2. I was most blessed, someone read it, I think 2 weeks ago, and I thought, yeah, that's exactly where I'm going. And it always blesses you that, doesn't it? It says, for he himself is our peace. Who's the he? It's Jesus. He is our peace. Who was made both one.
Yeah.
Who's the both? Well, the both in the context is the Jewish people and the Gentile people. So it says that God is in the business of joining us together in a way that is somehow different to grafting. And he says he's broken down the middle wall of separation. It's interesting that in the Jewish thought pattern you have Jewish and non-Jewish, Jewish and Gentile, if you like. He says that division, that separation, that alternate sides has gone. Why? So as to create himself one new man from the two, thus making one. So I believe there is still a Jewish people. They are still in the heart of God. They are not the state of Israel. But God has a plan that in Jesus Christ there is a breaking down of the division between us, so that the two become one new man. Now I haven't quite worked out what that looks like, but I don't have to. What I have to know is that God has a plan for us that is both halves of it, and the outcome of that plan will be something which is glorious and which is only one and not two. And on that sort of note, I think, just think about it.